Have you ever had that feeling, where you're constantly trying to plan for every little thing, optimize every single decision you make, and yet, well, life just keeps throwing these completely unexpected curveballs, things you just never saw coming.
Oh, absolutely.
That sense of being, I don't know, almost overwhelmed by unpredictability, where no matter how carefully you map things out, they just don't quite pan out the way you thought.
Right. The plan never quite survives contact with reality.
Exactly. Well, what if I told you there's a profoundly different way, maybe even a revolutionary way, of thinking about all that uncertainty, not just, surviving it, but actually benefiting from it?
Benefiting from chaos.
Yeah. What if volatility, what if chaos could actually be your allies? Today, we're diving deep, really deep, into the fascinating, paradigm-shifting world of Nassim Taleb's groundbreaking work, Antifragile.
A truly mind-bending book.
It really is. And our mission today is to unpack some genuinely powerful and often quite counterintuitive concepts from the text. We're talking about the transformative barbell strategy, the profound idea of optionality, and maybe most importantly, this really deeply fragilizing illusion that we somehow know exactly where we're going.
Or that we ever really did.
Right. Or that we ever did. So we're here to pull out practical, actionable insights from Taleb's framework, things to help you, our listener, understand how you might gain from disorder, from chaos, from uncertainty, in pretty much every part of your life.
Yeah, whether that's business strategy, personal finances, your career path.
Or even just your day-to-day decisions. It's really about building a life or systems that thrive under pressure rather than just breaking.
And to guide this whole exploration, we've drawn really extensively from detailed discussions, a lot of rigorous analysis, and specific excerpts from Taleb's work itself. So this isn't just a surface-level skim.
No, not at all.
We're aiming for a rich, nuanced perspective on these often quite challenging ideas. The goal is to give you a truly deep, practical understanding of how antifragility actually works, and maybe more importantly, how you can start cultivating it yourself. We'll be getting into the core arguments, the sometimes surprising examples, and the underlying logic that makes these concepts so incredibly, well, transformative.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the core idea, the foundation of Taleb's thinking. He argues that most things in life, businesses, nature, our own bodies, even when they face stress or volatility, they fall into one of three distinct categories.
The triad, he calls it.
Exactly, the triad. So first, things are fragile, they break, they degrade, they get worse when exposed to stress, shocks, disorder. Think of, a delicate teacup, drop it, it shatters.
Right, easy to understand.
Then there are things that are robust. These resist stress. They stay pretty much the same. They absorb blows without really changing significantly, maybe like a sturdy steel beam in a building.
It endures, but it doesn't change.
Right. But then, and this is the key, there's this third category. One Taleb argues we've largely overlooked, yet it holds the key to genuine resilience and growth. Antifragile.
Antifrat.
These are the things that actually get better, stronger, more capable, more efficient, because they're exposed to stress, disorder, volatility.
It's such a powerful concept because, as you said, we usually only think in terms of the first two, right? Fragile or robust.
Exactly. The profound implication is that for most of history, and even now, our default way of thinking is just about those first two. We desperately want to avoid breaking, avoid being fragile, or at best, we aim to be resilient, to be robust, to withstand things.
We rarely, if ever, stop to consider that stress, that chaos, even failure could actually be a good thing, a catalyst for improvement.
It feels counterintuitive.
It really does.
Yeah.
And that's precisely where anti-fragility offers this, well, revolutionary lens to view the world through. Moving to what Taleb calls the right side of the triad, it's not just about resisting shocks anymore. It's about actively designing and building systems, whether it's your investment portfolio, your company's structure, or even just your personal habits that are actually enhanced by those shocks.
Enhanced.
Yes. Think about a muscle. It doesn't just withstand the strain of a workout, does it? It grows stronger because of that strain. That's anti-fragility right there. It's about engineering yourself or your systems to actively gain from disorder, from volatility, even from errors.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental rethink of how we approach risk and uncertainty.
Yeah. Okay, so how do we get there? How do we start building that? Because Taleb makes this really provocative assertion, one that sounds almost too simple when you first hear it, but it really makes you stop and think.
I thought,
He says the very first step towards achieving antifragility is always to decrease your downside. Focus on that first before you worry about increasing your upside.
decrease downside first.
Yeah. It sounds almost obvious, doesn't it?
Mhm.
But think about how often it's missed. In our own decisions and company strategies, even national policies, we're almost instinctively wired to chase the upside, right? Seek growth, maximize returns.
Often without fully appreciating the hidden fragilities that might be lurking just beneath the surface.
Exactly.
And it's missed, Taleb argues, because fragility has this deeply unfortunate, almost inescapable property. It's irreversibility.
Ah, yeah.
Think about that package, the fragile one. If it breaks under stress, it doesn't just magically fix itself when things get better, does it?
Oh, yeah.
Once it's shattered, it's shattered. That's it.
No going back.
No going back. Taleb even likens extreme fragility to a terminal disease. Once something is truly broken beyond repair, that's the end of the game for that particular thing. There's this devastating finality to it, a one-way door. And this leads directly to another critical concept, path dependence.
Path dependence.
Mhm.
Okay, this idea really forces us to reconsider how we approach, well, pretty much everything involving steps or sequences. It's the idea that the route you take, the order of events, is absolutely paramount. It's not just about the final destination.
It's not just where you end up, but how you got there.
Yeah.
The sequence matters critically.
The journey itself changes the outcome.
Precisely. And the source gives some incredibly visceral, almost comically painful examples to hammer this home. Imagine, just for a second, having a kidney stone operation first,
Ouch.
and then afterwards getting the anesthesia.
Oh, God, no.
It's a fundamentally different experience, isn't it? Excruciatingly different compared to the correct sequence. The components are the same operation, anesthesia, but the order transforms it from medicine to torture.
All right. Okay, point taken.
Or think about enjoying a nice meal. You wouldn't start with coffee and dessert first, and then finish up with a bowl of tomato soup last, would you?
Definitely not. It just wouldn't work.
It wouldn't give you the same satisfaction, even if the individual dishes are identical. The path you take, the sequence, completely changes the outcome. Taleb's point is that the non-linearity, the path dependence of certain processes, means the sequence is crucial, and some sequences can lead to irreversible ruin, no matter what you do afterwards.
So why is this seemingly obvious point so often ignored, especially as the source notes by business people? They often seem trained in this kind of static thinking, focusing almost entirely on profit or growth.
Without prioritizing survival first, as if survival is just an afterthought.
Yeah, like profit is the main goal, and maybe we'll think about not going bust later.
They completely miss the strong logical precedents. Survival must come before success. One participant in the source material put it powerfully, talking about investing. The raw material is money. Right. So the first priority, above absolutely everything else, has to be preserving that wealth.
Keep the capital intact.
Exactly. Only then, once preservation is locked down, do you start thinking about how much more you can make. And the same holds true for life, for personal finances. Limiting your lifestyle, controlling your expenses, things largely within your control, is often a far more effective strategy for long-term survival than just blindly chasing more opportunities to earn more money, because earnings are fundamentally uncertain.
You can control your spending, but you can't fully control your income.
Precisely. Your expenses are knowable, controllable. Your earnings, subject to market whims, luck, black swans, utterly unknowable, really. You can keep experimenting, trying new things, but if your core capital, your foundation, is vulnerable, none of it matters if you hit a bad patch. It's asymmetric. Small, controllable actions on the downside versus unpredictable, potentially huge forces on the upside.
And this connects to another really key point that challenges how we measure success, right? Ideas like speed or growth. They're completely meaningless if they don't account for the underlying fragility.
Absolutely meaningless.
Yeah.
Or worse, deceptive.
We hear so much about rapid growth in companies or economies, but if it's built on shaky foundations.
It's like someone trying to drive 250 miles per hour through rush hour traffic in New York City.
Okay, bad idea.
A very bad idea. They are quite certain to never get anywhere. Their effective speed, despite the speedometer reading, is essentially zero, because a crash is almost guaranteed. It seems obvious, right? Yet somehow, in our modern socio-political talk, this elementary point gets completely masked.
We get dazzled by the speed.
We do. Path dependence fundamentally means you can't separate economic growth from the risk of recession. You can't separate financial returns from the ultimate risk of a terminal loss, a total wipeout. The whole notion of efficiency becomes meaningless if chasing it makes you drastically more likely to blow up entirely.
The source has that chilling example, doesn't it? The University Endowment Fund.
Oh, yes. A few years back, a prominent university endowment was bragging really trumpeting their 20% annual returns, celebrating their genius.
Sounds great on paper.
It did. But they were completely oblivious, it seems, to the fact that these fantastic returns were associated with fragilities that would easily turn into catastrophic losses under certain, maybe rare, but definitely possible conditions. And then, sure enough, as Taleb highlights, one single bad year, one unexpected market shock, it wiped out all those returns and endangered the university's very existence.
Wow, all gone.
All gone, and potentially worse. It just underscores this profound, maybe uncomfortable truth. If something is fundamentally fragile, the inherent risk of it breaking, of collapsing, makes everything else you do, improving efficiency, boosting returns, completely pointless, utterly inconsequential. Unless you first aggressively tackle that risk of breaking, everything else is built on sand.
It reminds me of that quote.
Publius Syrus. Nothing can be done both hastily and safely. Almost nothing anyway. Even something seemingly positive like GDP growth. Well, it can be achieved by loading future generations with massive debt.
Kicking the can down the road.
Exactly. Creating an illusion of prosperity today that just sets up a future collapse. Contrast that, Taleb says, with the robust growth of the Industrial Revolution, maybe modest percentages year on year, but incredibly durable, fundamentally robust. Compare that to the current fool's race of states shooting for growth like teenager drivers infatuated with speed, ignoring all the warning signs.
The faster it looks like it's growing, the more we need to ask.
At what cost? What's the hidden fragility?
Okay, so this is sobering. If fragility is so punishing, and if trying to find that perfect middle ground is often a trap full of hidden risks, what's the actual solution? This leads us straight to Taleb's big idea, doesn't it? The barbell strategy.
The barbell, yes. Or bimodal strategy. It's more than just a tactic. It's really a whole philosophy for dealing with uncertainty.
Visually, it's like a weightlifter's barbell, right?
Exactly. You've got the bar, and then heavy weights at both ends, and crucially, nothing or very little in the middle. Taleb uses this image to represent a combination of extremes, kept very separate with a deliberate avoidance of the middle.
So not necessarily balanced or symmetric.
Not necessarily symmetric, no. The weights don't have to be equal. It's just about having two distinct modes, a bimodal approach. And the key way this strategy achieves anti-fragility is by aggressively, ruthlessly eliminating the risk of ruin.
How does it do that?
It means you allocate your resources or your effort or your focus to two extremes. On one side, you put the vast majority into something maximally safe, incredibly conservative, maybe even boring.
The safe end of the barbell.
The safe end. Then you allocate a much smaller portion to the other side, something extremely risky, highly speculative, where the potential upside is huge, asymmetric, but crucially, your downside is strictly limited to that small amount you put in. And there's very little, if anything, in between in that dangerous middle zone.
Okay, the financial application makes this really concrete, I think. It's often the easiest way to grasp the barbell. How would you actually do that with your money?
Right, the classic financial barbell. You deliberately put a very large chunk, Taleb, often uses 90% as an example of your funds into something incredibly dull, maximally safe. Think short-term government bonds, maybe even just cash, or what he calls drawing on history, a numeric repository of value, basically an ultra-safe store of capital, something that guarantees principal preservation above all else, even if it earns next to nothing.
Your anchor, your fortress.
Exactly, your impenetrable core. Then, and here's the asymmetric part, you take the remaining small portion, say 10%, and you put it into very risky, maximally speculative things.
Like what?
Maybe early-stage venture capital, maybe highly volatile options trading, perhaps a tiny concentrated bet on a single, audacious startup. Things with massive potential upside.
Okay, I see the extremes.
And the beauty, the real elegance of this is that you cannot possibly lose more than 10% of your total capital. That's your maximum loss, locked in, defined up front. But at the same time, you are exposed to massive, theoretically unlimited upside from that small speculative slice.
Compared to the usual advice.
Exactly. Contrast that with someone who follows the standard advice and puts 100% of their money into so-called medium-risk securities, a typical diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds.
The balanced portfolio.
The balanced portfolio. While it seems moderate, Taleb argues this middle strategy often carries a hidden and potentially catastrophic risk of total ruin. Why? Because of the miscomputation of risk, especially the risks of those very rare extreme events. The black swans.
You can't model them properly.
You really can't. They are inherently incomputable, and our estimates are incredibly fragile. The barbell fixes this. It makes the catastrophic event for the safe 90% literally impossible, and for the risky 10%, the loss is strictly limited to a small, predetermined, acceptable amount.
So it's like aggressiveness plus paranoia, as he puts it.
That's a great way to put it. Aggressively clip your downside. Protect yourself from that extreme harm, that ruin, and then let the upside, the positive swans, take care of itself. The big gains, the favorable outcomes, can often come simply from being incredibly diligent about reducing that extreme downside risk, not just by trying to tweak things in the risky, uncertain middle. It's survival first, allowing you to stick around long enough to benefit from the good surprises.
That's a really powerful reframe. Okay, so that's finance. But you said this isn't just about money. Where else does this barbell thinking show up? How does it apply to, say, organizations?
Oh, it absolutely does. Consider organizational strategy. The source mentions the founders of Infosys, the big Indian IT company. As they were growing, they had a very specific, very anti-fragile rule. They never flew together.
Ah, right. I've heard of that.
It wasn't superstition. It was a cold, hard, rational calculation of catastrophic risk. If one plane crashes with all the key leaders on board,
The whole company is gone instantly.
exactly, an irreversible terminal event. So instead, they consciously barbelled their travel balancing flights across different times, different airlines, ensuring no single event could trigger total ruin.
Smart.
And this leads Taleb to that vivid image of an organizational barbell. You want a paranoid pilot at the controls, someone obsessively focused on safety, on worst-case scenarios, but you pair that with maximally optimistic flight attendants who focus on service, growth, customer experience, the upside.
You separate the functions to the extremes.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You avoid that wishy-washy middle attitude in critical, risky matters by separating the functions. One side is maximum caution, the other is maximal optimism and opportunity seeking. They don't try to blend into some fragile compromise in the middle.
Okay, now Taleb often finds these parallels in, let's say, unexpected places. And the source discusses one that's definitely provocative, maybe controversial. This 90% accountant, 10% rock star mating strategy. We should stress, we're just reporting the idea from the source here, not endorsing it.
Absolutely. It's purely an illustration of the barbell principle's potential reach, as presented in the source material. The description is that, in certain species, including, arguably, humans, females, might tend to, metaphorically speaking, marry the equivalent of the accountant.
Meaning?
Someone stable, reliable, a good provider, offering security for raising offspring. This effectively limits the downside risk in terms of survival, stability, resources.
The safe 90%.
The safe 90%, exactly. But then, as Taleb provocatively suggests, based on some biological studies, once in a while they cheat with the aggressive alpha, the rock star.
The risky 10%.
The risky 10%. This is presented in this source as a potential dual strategy, limiting the downside with a stable partner while seeking genetic upside or some great fun or both through what biologists call extra pair copulation.
And the timing isn't random.
Apparently not, according to the research cited. The timing often seems to correspond with periods of high likelihood of pregnancy, maximizing the chance of getting potentially diverse or better genes. He notes this is well observed in species like non-monogamous birds, where a significant chunk of offspring often come from outside the main pair bond. It's framed as a kind of biological evolutionary barbell.
The evolutionary theories behind it are interesting, balancing the need for stability and resources with a drive for maybe better genes, which might not always come from the same middle ground individual.
Or, as another interpretation goes, simply balancing a stable life with, well, good fun. Again, putting aside any moral judgment, which isn't the point here, it's presented as a natural system, potentially finding an anti-fragile barbell-like solution, separating risk aversion from risk-taking to maximize different kinds of evolutionary payoffs.
It's definitely a stark reminder that nature's solutions aren't always intuitive or comfortable for our human sensibilities.
Indeed. Nature optimizes for survival and propagation, not necessarily for our social norms.
Okay, moving away from biology. What about creative careers? Writers, artists, thinkers. How does the barbell apply there? The source mentions a tradition, especially among European writers.
Ah, yes, the sinecure. This long tradition among French and other European literary figures of deliberately seeking out a kind of anxiety-free, often government job, a civil servant role maybe, with minimal intellectual demands, high job security.
Basically a safe, boring job.
Pretty much. The kind of low-risk, undemanding work that you can just switch off from the moment you leave the office. And then they spend their spare time completely free from financial pressure or the need to please anyone else, writing purely to their own standards. Immune to commercial pressures, immune to academic fads.
And this is contrasted with.
It's contrasted sharply with the path many American writers take, often becoming academics or journalists. This route, the source argues, can turn them into prisoners of the system. Their writing becomes tied to grants, tenure reviews, pleasing editors, chasing clicks, which Taleb believes can corrupt their writing, leading to a severe bastardization of the soul.
Strong words.
Very. He argues every line written purely to someone else's standard kills a corresponding segment deep inside. That's why you see these powerful examples. Paul Claudel, St. John Perse, they were diplomats. Kafka worked for an insurance company. And maybe the best example, Spinoza, the philosopher, was a lens grinder.
A lens grinder.
Yes. His philosophy, the source notes, was therefore completely immune to any form of academic corruption. His daily bread came from something totally separate, mundane, safe. He wasn't dependent on his philosophical writings for his bills. It allowed him to think and write with absolute freedom, making his work truly anti-fragile to external pressures. His core output was robust against the market or academic whims.
That leads nicely into the idea of a serial barbell, not doing two things at once, but sequencing your life. Safe first, then speculative.
Exactly. Building a solid foundation first, which then gives you the option, the freedom, to take massive risks later. The source gives an example of a friend of Taleb's. This person meticulously built a very secure profession as a book editor, became excellent at it, built a reputation, a safety net, solid ground. Then, after maybe a decade, once that base was unshakable, he left completely for something speculative and highly risky, a totally different high-upside venture. But the key was he had the ultimate safety net. He could always fall back on the previous profession should the speculation fail.
The optionality was there.
The optionality was there, removing the risk of ruin from the big bet. Seneca, the Roman philosopher, famously did something similar. He had a very active, often risky political and financial life first, and then made a deliberate philosophical withdrawal to write and reflect. He didn't try to juggle both precariously at the same time.
Action, then reflection. Separated.
Separated. Like Montaigne, too. Periods of pure action, then periods of pure reflection. Avoiding the muddled, fragile mix. It's about achieving anti-fragility sequentially over a lifetime.
Okay, but what if you can't just quit your job? What if you have to work continuously? How does the barbell apply to work-life balance or productivity then?
It's not necessarily about working less, but working differently. Taleb expresses a very strong preference to work intensely for short, focused hours, then do nothing for the rest of the time until I recover completely.
Intense bursts, then total rest.
Exactly. He contrasts this sharply with the tedium of Japanese style, low integrity, interminable office hours with sleep deprivation. That endless, mediocre grind that just leaves you exhausted but not truly productive.
The constant low-level stress.
Right. The barbell approach here is separating intense, high-quality output from complete restorative rest, avoiding that continuous, diluted, and ultimately fragile state of semi-effort. George Simenon, the incredibly prolific writer, is cited as a perfect example.
Simenon.
Yeah, he only wrote for about 60 days a year. The other 300 days, he did very little, relatively speaking, yet he published over 200 novels.
Wow, 60 days for 200 novels over his career. That's incredible focus.
Incredible focus, intense, concentrated bursts of work, followed by long periods of recovery, thinking, letting ideas percolate. That led to extraordinary output while avoiding the fragility of burnout.
Okay, let's talk personal risk management. How can we as individuals apply this barbell thinking to the risks in our own lives, deciding what to embrace and what to ruthlessly avoid?
Taleb is very open about his own approach here, which is quite illustrative. He describes himself as personally completely paranoid about certain risks, then very aggressive with others.
The barbell again, paranoid and aggressive.
Exactly. His personal rules are stark and non-negotiable. No smoking, no sugar. Okay? No motorcycles, no bicycles in town unless it's somewhere totally traffic-free like the Sahara, he jokes. No mixing with Eastern European mafias, probably good advice for most of us. And no getting on a plane not flown by a professional pilot.
So these are the risks with potentially catastrophic, irreversible downsides.
Precisely. The terminal risks. The ones that can take you out of the game completely. He simply eliminates them, cuts them off. But outside of those carefully chosen, potentially fatal dangers, he says he takes all manner of professional and personal risks, especially those where there's no risk of terminal injury.
So eliminate the possibility of total ruin.
And then you're free to be incredibly bold with everything else, knowing your absolute downside is protected. That, he argues, is what real freedom is. not avoiding risk altogether, but choosing your risks intelligently, barbell style.
It sounds like this extends even to the level of social policy, how societies can structure themselves to be more anti-fragile.
Yes, definitely. In social policy, Taleb suggests a barbell approach would involve protecting the very weak, providing a strong safety net at the bottom, and letting the strong do their job, allowing for dynamism, risk-taking, and competition higher up.
And this is contrasted with,
It's contrasted sharply with the common political approach of helping the middle class to consolidate its privileges. He argues this focus on the middle actually blocks evolution, stifles necessary creative destruction, and ultimately brings all manner of economic problems that tend to hurt the poor the most in the long run.
so helping the middle hinders dynamism.
That's the argument. It prevents the natural, volatile, but ultimately necessary cycles of failure and renewal. He points to the historical UK as an example of a societal barbell before it became more of a bureaucratic welfare state. It was effectively barbelled into adventurers and an aristocracy.
Adventures in aristocracy.
Yeah, the aristocracy provided a conservative, stabilizing, almost inert, anchor-preserving traditions, institutions, order. That's one end of the barbell. The other end was the adventurers, the traders, explorers, entrepreneurs, roaming the globe, taking huge risks for potentially huge gains. This complementary structure, he suggests, fostered a kind of societal anti-fragility, innovation and bold exploration happening alongside fundamental stability.
That's a fascinating historical perspective. How about intellectually? How we learn, interact, even choose our social circles. It seems geared towards avoiding conformity.
Absolutely. Avoiding the mushy middle ground. Taleb's own writing strategies is a perfect example. He aims for two distinct modes.
Yeah.
On one hand, a literary essay that can be grasped by anyone, aiming for broad impact, accessible language. And on the other hand, technical papers, highly rigorous, mathematical, aimed at specialists.
And nothing in between.
And crucially, nothing in between. He avoids that middle ground of, say, semi-academic jargon or polite, watered-down arguments designed to appease everyone. It's either broad and impactful or deep and technical. Same with exercise. The maximum weight one can lift, that intense, brief, extreme effort, then nothing. Maybe supplemented by long, leisurely walks, no monotonous, moderate routine.
And socially.
Socially, he advises talking to either undergraduate students, cab drivers, gardeners, people with fresh, unfiltered perspectives, or the highest caliber scholars, people with deep expertise. But actively avoid the middle, the meddling but career-conscious academics who might be trapped in conformity or office politics.
Interesting choices.
And even with dislikes. If you dislike someone, his advice is equally extreme. Leave him alone, or eliminate him, presumably metaphorically, or don't attack him verbally. Basically, engage fully or disengage completely. Avoid the tepid, draining, middle ground conflicts or associations. It's about seeking intellectual and social extremes, avoiding that fragile, uninspiring middle.
Wow. Okay, there's even a surprising application of this to alcohol.
Yes. This one comes via Rory Sutherland, the ad executive and behavioral science guy. He suggests that instead of trying to meticulously moderate your daily alcohol intake down to some specific small amount.
The typical health advice.
Right. The optimum policy, Sutherland argues, might actually be to avoid alcohol completely 3 times a week, then drink liberally the remaining 4. Again, it's not about promoting binge drinking. It's about the barbell logic. It acknowledges the body might benefit from both complete abstinence periods, allowing full recovery, system reset, and periods of, let's say, less inhibited enjoyment, rather than a continuous low-level intake that might be subtly fragilizing and offers neither true recovery nor full enjoyment.
Extremes again, abstinence and indulgence, separated.
Exactly. Avoiding the golden middle and opting for distinct states that might each offer unique benefits. It's a provocative take on personal habits.
Okay, so zooming out again, all these examples. The barbell, avoiding the middle. What does this tell us about how we fundamentally view our lives and make decisions? Taleb points to a major human error here, doesn't he? The teleological fallacy.
Yes. This is huge. He argues it's one of the most fragilizing errors we make. The teleological fallacy is basically the illusion that you know exactly where you're going and, maybe even more insidiously, that you knew exactly where you were going in the past.
Like we have this clear plan or destiny.
Exactly. It's this deeply ingrained idea, going all the way back to Aristotle, that agents, people, companies, us, always act out of intention for an end. We assume there's always a clear goal, a predefined purpose driving actions. It's the seductive narrative of clear paths and predictable outcomes.
And this is damaging.
Hugely damaging, Taleb argues. This kind of thinking, amplified over centuries by what he calls an illusion of unconditional scientific understanding. This belief that we can predict and control everything has caused a great deal of damage. It assumes we have perfect foresight, which we clearly don't. It implies that success only comes from having a rigid, unwavering plan from the start.
Which makes us fragile.
Precisely. Because when the unpredictable inevitably happens, as it always does, our rigid plans shatter. And worse, we often lack the mental flexibility to adapt, to see the new opportunities that randomness throws up, because we're so fixated on the original, now obsolete plan. We become blind to serendipity. We're trying to follow a map when the landscape itself has changed.
So what's the alternative to this fallacy? Taleb offers the idea of the rational flaneur.
Yes, the rational flaneur. It's such a liberating concept, especially if you ever feel trapped by rigid plans or schedules.
What is a flaneur exactly?
A flaneur, in Taleb's framing, is someone who, unlike a typical tourist taking off boxes, makes a decision at every step to revise his schedule so he can imbibe things based on new information. He mentions Nero, the Roman emperor, supposedly trying to practice this on his travels, sometimes just following his sense of smell, letting his senses guide him to unexpected discoveries.
So not a prisoner of the plan.
Exactly. Not a prisoner of a plan. Tourism, by contrast, is often imbued with a teleological illusion. It gets you locked into hard-to-revise programs, right? Where every missed site feels like a failure against the checklist. The flaneur, crucially, continuously, rationally modifies his target as he acquires new information. It's an active, intelligent wandering, embracing opportunism and serendipity, letting the journey reveal the destination, in a way.
That sounds great for exploring a city or maybe for business, but Taleb adds a warning, right?
A very important one, yes. This kind of opportunism, this rational flaneur approach, is great in life and business. Flexibility, adapting to new data, these are virtues there. But, he stresses, it is emphatically not in personal life and matters that involve others.
Why not?
Because in personal relationships, loyalty, which he calls a truly noble and fragile sentiment, is paramount. You can be a rational flaneur in your career choices, always scanning for better opportunities. But you shouldn't be a flaneur in your marriage or deep friendships, where consistency, commitment, fidelity are non-negotiable. It highlights that anti-fragility, or the strategies for it, are domain-specific. What works in business might be disastrous in ethics.
That's a really crucial distinction. Okay, connecting this back to innovation. We often make the mistake of thinking we know exactly what customers want or what the market needs. We do surveys, focus groups.
Right. Asking people what they want, the classic teleological approach to innovation. And this is precisely where Taleb points to the genius of someone like Steve Jobs. His core strength, the source argues, was precisely in distrusting market research and focus groups.
He ignored them.
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
His famous motto captures it perfectly. People don't know what they want until you provide them with it. Did people know they wanted a graphical user interface before Xerox BRSC and Apple? Did they know they wanted an easy-to-use MP3 player like the iPod or an iPhone? No.
How couldn't imagine it?
They couldn't. Jobs, through relentless tinkering, trial and error, and an almost uncanny ability to envision possibilities others couldn't, provided these things. He created the demand and this ability, this flexibility to switch from a predetermined course of action based on intuition, feedback, experimentation that is the very essence of optionality.
Optionality, having the right but not the obligation to do something.
Exactly. And optionality in its purest, most powerful form is what makes you anti-fragile. It lets you benefit from the positive side of uncertainty, the unexpected good stuff, without corresponding serious harm from the negative side, the unexpected bad stuff. It creates that beautiful asymmetry.
And this applies to whole systems too, like countries.
Absolutely. The source argues that America's principal asset, its core anti-fragility, isn't just its resources or military, but its pervasive culture of risk-taking and its institutionalized use of optionality. The remarkable ability to engage in rational forms of trial and error. And critically, the relative lack of comparative shaming in failing, starting again, and repeating failure.
It's okay to fail and try again.
It's more accepted culturally than in many other places. Contrast this with societies, maybe like traditional Japan or parts of India, where failure can carry immense social shame. This discourages experimentation, makes people hide risks, and ultimately renders the whole system less adaptable, less anti-fragile. America's true strength, Taleb might argue, lies not just in its successes, but in its freedom to fail on the path to those successes.
Okay, this is where it gets really cool, I think. Let's dive into this ancient story that perfectly illustrates optionality long before we had fancy financial terms for it. Thales of Miletus.
Ugh, Thales, the philosopher, mathematician, one of the seven sages, and, as the source notes, known for being characteristically impecunious. Basically, not rolling in dough.
Not a rich guy.
Not a rich guy. And apparently he got a bit tired of his peers, subtly suggesting that philosophy was nice, but, those who can do and others philosophize. Implying his work wasn't practical or valuable in the real world.
So he decided to show them.
He decided to demonstrate his prowess. The story goes he observed the stars, did his calculations, and predicted, maybe not with absolute certainty, but with a higher probability than others, saw that the upcoming olive harvest would be unusually bountiful.
Okay, so he had some insight.
He had some insight, yes, but watch what he did with it. He didn't just bet the farm on olives. Instead, he went around and made a small down payment on the seasonal use of every single olive press in his area, Miletus and Chios. He locked them up at a low rent during the off-season when nobody wanted them.
He cornered the market on presses cheaply.
Cheaply? And with limited risk, just his small down payments. Then, lo and behold, the harvest comes in, and it's extremely bountiful, just as he suspected. Suddenly, everyone desperately needs an olive press, and demand skyrockets.
And Thales holds all the keys.
He holds all the keys. So he then released the owners on his own terms, essentially renting out his right to use the presses at a much, much higher price.
He built a substantial fortune very quickly.
Wow.
And the best part, once he'd made his point, proved that his intellect could translate into practical wealth if he chose, he apparently just went straight back to philosophizing. He showed he was above, not below wealth. He could generate it, but wasn't enslaved by the need for it.
Okay, but Aristotle, who wrote this story down, apparently missed the real point.
That's Taleb's crucial insight. Aristotle recorded the story, but attributed Thales' success purely to his superior knowledge of astronomy. He thought Thales just made a really accurate prediction, a deterministic view.
So why does Taleb say Aristotle got the center point of his own anecdote exactly backwards? Because Thales didn't need perfect prediction. He didn't need to know with 100% certainty the harvest would be good. His genius wasn't just prediction, it was how he structured the bet. He benefited from the fundamental asymmetry built into the contract he created. He leveraged what we now call an option.
He paid a small price for a potentially huge payoff with limited risk.
Exactly. That's the core of an option contract, isn't it? Well, the right, but not the obligation, for the buyer. Thales had the right to use those presses if demand surged. Good harvest. But absolutely no obligation to use them if the harvest was poor. His loss was capped at his small initial down payments. Limited, known downside. But his potential gain was huge, uncapped, dependent on that uncertain harvest outcome.
So he structured it to win big if he was right and lose small if he was wrong.
Precisely. This, Taleb says, was the very option on record, the first documented example of someone using an option structure. It perfectly embodies antifragility, because the option, in its pure form, is an agent of antifragility. It fundamentally removes the risk of ruin from the equation for the option holder. It clips the downside. It reminds me of Ray Dalio's rule for big bets. Make sure the probability of the unacceptable is nil.
Make sure you can't get wiped out.
That's exactly what Thales did. He ensured his maximum loss was small and acceptable. His upside, however, driven by randomness, the harvest size, was potentially enormous. He didn't need perfect prediction. He just needed to structure his exposure to benefit from favorable randomness while being shielded from the unfavorable kind. It's a masterclass in gaining from disorder.
And the money Thales made, Taleb calls it something specific, doesn't he? Fuku money.
Yes, Fuku money. It's not just about being rich. It's about a certain kind of wealth.
What kind?
Fuku money is defined as a sum large enough to get you most, if not all, of the advantages of wealth, like freedom, independence, peace of mind, but crucially, not its side effects.
The downsides of being rich.
Exactly. What are those side effects? Taleb paints a funny picture. Things like having to attend a black tie charity event and being forced to listen to a polite exposition of details of marble rich house innovations from people you find boring or don't respect.
Oh, okay.
It's the money that buys you freedom from the social obligations, the
Yes.
networking, the status games, the consumption traps that often come with massive wealth. It allows for independence from the social association it forces. Thales just went back to philosophy, right? He wasn't suddenly obligated to hang out with olive oil tycoons. Fuku money buys you options in life without forcing you into a new, potentially fragile social cage.
freedom without the golden handcuffs.
Perfectly put.
So let's try and bring this all together then. We've covered anti-fragility, the barbell strategy, optionality. These aren't just, interesting academic ideas. They feel like really powerful, practical frameworks, ways to navigate a world that's just inherently uncertain, always throwing surprises at us, increasingly defined by chaos.
Absolutely. They're about domesticating randomness, not pretending we can eliminate it. It's about ensuring that when the unexpected hits, and it will hit you, don't just survive, you actually thrive. You get stronger.
It's a complete shift in mindset, isn't it? From being a passive victim of volatility to actively becoming a strategic beneficiary of it, building a life or systems that don't just endure shocks, but evolve and grow stronger because of them.
Exactly. And maybe here's something for you, the listener, to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. Think about your own life. How could you apply this barbell strategy to an area that currently feels like it's in that medium risk zone? Maybe it's your career path, your financial planning, beyond just stocks, maybe even your personal health habits. Could that seemingly safe middle ground actually be a sucker's game, as Taleb might put it, full of hidden fragilities you haven't acknowledged?
Where might you be playing it too safe in the middle?
Right. What small strategic steps could you take right now to aggressively clip your downside in that area? Protect yourself from real harm. And at the same time, maybe with a small separate part of your resources or effort, expose yourself to massive asymmetric upside. Where are you unconsciously assuming the balanced approach is best when maybe a more extreme barbelled approach, combining intense safety with intense but contained risk, could unlock true anti-fragility and let you gain from the inevitable chaos ahead?
That's a fantastic question to leave us with. Where are our hidden fragilities in the middle? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Antifragile. We really hope you found it useful, and we encourage you to keep exploring these powerful ideas on your own. Think about how you can apply them, observe the world through this lens, and maybe start gaining from the inherent disorder all around us.